I tend to talk about lobsters more than the average person. And one of the points I made in 12 Rules for Life was that our neurochemistry, at least some of it, is so similar. It's been conserved so completely throughout the immense duration of evolution, hundreds of millions of years, that lobsters, like human beings, appear to become the lobster equivalent of depressed if they suffer a hierarchy defeat. And that if you give them chemicals that are roughly analogous to human antidepressants, it perks them right back up. Their posture improves and they'll go off and fight. And when I first discovered that, it just blew me away. I never recovered from it. I thought, my God, really, there's 350 million years of continuity in the structure of those systems. And, we know the serotonin system, which is the system I'm talking about, does govern your observation of where you sit in a social hierarchy, like it does for many, many animal species. And as one consequence of that, regulates your emotions, so that if it sees that you're a relatively high status creature in your local environment, then it tends to allow you to feel more positive emotion and less negative emotion. And if it sees you as a low status creature in your local comparative environment, then it does the opposite. It overwhelms you with negative emotion and suppresses positive emotion. And so, and that's really bad. No one likes that. There's really nothing worse that can happen to you than that. To have those emotions readjusted in that manner, so that the incentive reward and the motivation and the positive emotion vanishes from your life. So there's nothing to be enthusiastic or excited about. All of the negative emotions, pain, disappointment, frustration, grief, all of those terrible negative emotions are tremendously magnified. No one wants that. It's the last thing you want. Perhaps it's the last thing you want. And that's partly why people are very, let's call it, what would you say? They're willing to fight for their position in their status hierarchy, and even for the existence of the hierarchies themselves. It is the case that human beings have a nature, and we have to contend with that nature, and so we can't just create our own values. And what Jung, especially Jung, Freud started it, but especially Jung, believed that, well, in some sense, what had happened was that we had lost the externalized religious narrative that had been projected by our imagination out onto the world. You think about the constellations and the names of the constellations, and the idea that the skies were populated by gods. That was an externalization of our imagination, right? Projected out into the world. We're seeing the world through our imagination, which is exactly how we do see the world. And as we proceed, we're better able to distinguish, let's say, what's imagination from what's objective world. But that doesn't mean the imagination disappears or that it's without value, because the imagination is part of what helps us, let's say, confront the future, because we do that with our imagination, and to compose things in possibility before we realize them in actuality. So for Jung, the world of gods just collapsed within, back into the imagination, and it was into the imagination that we had to go again to discover what we had lost, to discover these lost values. And that's akin, in some sense, I suppose, to rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. A very brilliant intellectual tour de force to manage that supposition, especially back when he did it. And I think I see no evidence whatsoever that he was wrong, given, as I said, our radical inability to command ourselves as if we are our own in some fundamental way. We seem subject to intractable moral laws. Intractable moral laws. We seem subject to intractable moral laws. And I'm not trying to make a case for the accuracy of those laws necessarily, or for their metaphysical origin, but I am trying to make a case for their psychological and phenomenological reality. You definitely experience them insofar as you suffer, let's say, from the pricks and arrows of your own conscience. And I doubt if there's a single person in this room who doesn't regularly suffer in that manner, and some of you suffer like that virtually all the time, which can also be a problem. In any case, it's interesting to note that we're not exactly masters in our own houses, and that's such an interesting thing to note, because you think, well, if we're not masters in our own houses, well, what is it? Is it just a chaotic internal structure? Is it merely the voice of nature and nature's various instinctual subsystems? That doesn't seem to be correct, because we do integrate them into something approximating a unity. There's more than just the basics of nature. We have language, we have communication, we have culture. We build up above nature something that's more than nature, but we're still beholden to it. The question is, well, what are we beholden to? What is this that we're beholden to? Socially, politically, and individually, that we cannot escape from? Well, so that's part of the question. Do you believe in God? Well, that's part of the answer, actually. And it's no bleak answer. But do you believe in God? Well, that's part of the answer, actually. And it's no bleak answer. But the first thing I'm trying to say is, try controlling yourself. Try acting as if you're the fundamental source of your own values, independent of any, what would you call it, transcendent ethical structure. To see if you can do that. Try it for a week, try it for a month. I've never met anybody that could do it, not even for a moment. I mean, I don't know how many of you have read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, but I would highly recommend that if you're interested in this sort of thing, because it's the definitive study of this idea. Because in Crime and Punishment, the protagonist commits the perfect murder, and he has his reasons for it, and many reasons, because Dostoevsky didn't mess around. When he wanted to give someone reasons, he gave them reasons, and Raskolnikov, the main character, had reasons for murder. And then he commits his murder, and he gets away with it. But things don't go well for Raskolnikov. because one of the things he finds out is that the Raskolnikov that you were before you committed the murder is not the same as the Raskolnikov as you are after you've committed the murder. And there's a dividing line there that you don't. It's like the red pill, I guess, right? That's the Matrix, correct? The red pill. And there's certain actions, once you take them, there's no going back. And so that's what Crime and Punishment is about. Raskolnikov tortures himself to death. Well, not literally, but metaphysically, psychologically, because he cannot tolerate breaking the great moral code. One of the other speakers on the panel, Van Badham, who was described not by me as a writer, activist, and Twitter queen, which is, I think, like being the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, something like that. I went on her Twitter site today to find out how many followers she has, but apparently I'm not one of them because I'm blocked. And it kind of surprises me because I didn't know that I'd ever tried to follow her. But anyways, she said, and this was interesting, she said, I'm a Christian and a Marxist. And I thought, no. You can only be a Christian and a Marxist if you, well, there's a couple of ways. One is that you just want to be all things that are good at once, regardless of their internal contradictions. And so that would be one reason. And another reason would be that you don't know anything about Christianity or Marxism. And then the next would be that you're just compartmentalized. You know, like there's this idea that people can't hold two contradictory thoughts in their mind at the same time. Well, that idea was formulated by someone who's never met a human being, because you can hold like 50 contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time, as you know whenever you argue with someone that you love. Because you love them, and maybe you even like them, but you also hate them, and you wish that you could just crush them right there and then. And so, like, that's a lot of contradictory ideas, and that's probably only like half the contradictory ideas that are running through your mind at the moment. So, man, you're so full of contradictions that it's just beyond belief. I mean, I know this because I read undergraduate essays. What's interesting about undergraduate essays, the undergraduate will make a claim in paragraph 1, and then in paragraph 7 will make the opposite claim. And they won't notice that they're intellectually incommensurate. And you know, that might happen 30 times in the essay. And the reason that works is because, well, they haven't been called on the paradoxes, but also because they haven't had to live the paradoxes through, because you really only straighten out your thought when you have like impulse A and impulse B, and they conflict at the same time, right? And you can either do one or the other, but not both. You know, if it's A today and B tomorrow, well then you can hold those ideas simultaneously. But if it's A or B right now, then you have to decide, is A more important or is B more important? You have to put them in a hierarchy, and then you have to act them out, and you have to see what happens. And so so then you find out if you're full of contradictions, and part of the way that you iron out your contradictions, which is very, very hard to do, is that you go out and you do a whole bunch of things in the world, like Socrates did. You have your adventure in the world, and you put your ideas to the test, and those that work out in a paradoxical or counterproductive manner you dispense with or put lower on the priority list or something like that. And that's how you discover that, you can't hold incommensurate views simultaneously. That are not made conscious will be played out in the world as fate. And that's really worth thinking about too. So if you have let's call it your typical negative experience, it's this thing that seems to just keep happening to you, bad luck, let's call it, it's highly probable that there's a set of ideas that are occupying you, preoccupying you, possessing you, that are driving you in this direction continually, and that you can't or won't work out the contradiction. And as a consequence, maybe you think every woman is your mother, and you haven't noticed that you think that, and that and it is something that people think, because mothers are women, and it's not a bad initial template, but you gotta modify it to some degree. And if that's an unconscious idea that you have and you continue to play it out, you may run into your continual, habitual negative experience with women, and you'll wonder what the hell is wrong with women, but it isn't the women that has the problem, it's you. And, if you run into problems with women all the time, then it's highly probable that the problem is you. So, not always, but generally. This Marxist and Christian idea here just for a minute. So we'll start with some of the ideas of Marx. Well, Marx believed that people were basically socially constructed so that we were blank slates, and that whatever our nature was given to us essentially by our surroundings, but even more importantly by our social class, right? Because Marx was a theorist of social class, believed that the primary let's say, the primary motivator of human history, the primary driver of human history was something like the rich versus the poor, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, and that was a consequence of your social upbringing, and that your group identity was paramount. Okay, so there's nothing about that that's vaguely Christian. That's not how the Christian worldview works, not how the Judeo-Christian worldview works. Because in that worldview, you're fundamentally an individual. Your nature is fundamentally attributable to you by God. You're fundamentally responsible to God. And and history itself is something like the playing out of your relationship to the transcendent. So those things aren't the same. They're not commensurate. You can't believe both of them at the same time. Marxism is a materialistic philosophy. It's predicated on the idea that, essentially, an idea that Dostoevsky criticized in great depth was that if you just made people rich enough, let's say, if you deprived them of their privation, if you equalized their economic status, let's say, that the utopia would come to light upon earth. And, I have a certain amount of sympathy for a viewpoint like that, because, who likes starvation and misery? there's nothing positive to be said about that. But I think Dostoevsky was right too in his criticism of Marxism, although he wasn't directly aiming this at Marx, in Notes from Underground, where he noted that, if you gave people what they wanted in terms of, let's say, bread and circuses, they had, as he said, nothing to do but eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, which is kind of a nice phrase. The first thing they would do is take a hammer and smash things just so that something improbable and strange would happen, just so that we could have our way. And it's kind of a recapitulation of the idea of original sin in Dostoevsky's subtle manner, is that we're the sorts of creatures that, what did he say? We're ungrateful. That's the thing that primarily distinguishes us from animals, is we're ungrateful and that we can curse. That was what he thought made us different than animals. And that even if we got what we wanted materially, that wouldn't satisfy us, because we're not the sorts of creatures that can be satisfied with material possessions, let's say, or material comfort, because it isn't even obvious that we're after comfort. What do you want? You want to just lay in a feather bed and eat peeled grapes all day? I mean, maybe for an hour or so. That might not be a bad idea, but, it's going to get dull pretty quick. You're going to go out looking for trouble. And it's certainly possible that the more material resources, and the easier they were to get, that you have at your disposal, the more creative ways you're going to find to cause yourself trouble when you go out and look for trouble. And that's a testament to the human spirit, and Dostoevsky knew this. It's like, well, whatever we're here for, it isn't the utopia of equal material distribution. That's not, we're not looking to be fed and asleep, And I don't know what it is that we're looking for. God only knows. Maybe what we're looking for is to continually keep looking, something like that. I mean, that's the sorts of creatures that we are. But the materialist philosophy is that, well, if you just provided for people economically, problem over. And no, wrong. Of you are, as given that you're going to be ill in one way or another, and that you're still subject to mortality and all of the terrible natural limitations that human beings are characterized by, you're about as well off as you're going to get. The economic data already show that once you have enough money so that bill collectors aren't chasing you, which basically puts you, say, at the kind of in the upper reaches of the working class, or maybe the lower end of the middle class, something like that, that additional money has absolutely no effect whatsoever on your self-reported well-being, which is something like a combination of positive emotion and absence of negative emotion. So you might like to think that, if you were rich, your life would be better. And maybe it would be somewhat better, but it wouldn't be as much better as you might hope. And that's because you'd still have most of the problems that people have. You still maybe wouldn't get along with your sister, and you'd still get divorced. Maybe you'd even be more likely to, and there'd still be illnesses that would beset you. You'd be able to deal with them perhaps with some degree of more urgency. And you'd still have the problem with what the hell your life is for and what you're doing on the planet and how to conduct yourself in the proper way. And so we don't want to be too naive about materialism, even though we don't want to be ungrateful for its advantages. ungrateful for its advantages. Ungrateful for its advantages. You're going to go out looking for trouble. Looking for trouble. Marx also believed, well, I said this already, that, history is basically characterized by the war of socioeconomic groups. That's been transformed more recently into the war of identity groups, which is the same damn thing, and it's the same old wolf in new sheep's clothing as far as I'm concerned, that, the best way to conceptualize human beings is, well, I don't know, whatever your damn identity is. Maybe it's sex for you, and it's ethnicity for you, gender for you, and God only knows what it is for you, and that's who you identify with, and all there is in the world, and this is the postmodernist view, is hierarchies of people in these identity groups struggling for dominion. And that's a quasi-Marxist viewpoint. It's just a variant of the bourgeoisie versus proletariat theory of history, which is a foolish theory, as far as I'm concerned, and certainly not one that we need to take forward into the 21st century, although we seem, destined to insist that we do so. He believed that the revolutionary overthrow of the oppressor class was necessary and morally demanded, and that turns out to be a little bloodier than I would say the typical Judeo-Christian ethic might require, because it doesn't require you to take up arms against your evil overlords and, put them in gulags and kill them by the millions, for example, and that to me seems to be an important difference. There's no, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's no guilt, there's no group guilt, right? You're guilty and you're guilty of different things, I presume, and that's your problem, but maybe you're also innocent, who knows, but whatever, it's on you. It's not a consequence of your racial heritage or your ethnicity or your gender, any of those things. It's between you and God, let's say. Between you and the state, even. But at least it's between you and the state or God. It's not like, your father was a factory owner, let's say your grandfather, and so it was perfectly reasonable during the Russian Revolution and the Red Terror to vacuum you up along with your whole family and do away with you because you'd been irredeemably tainted by your bourgeoisie past. So that's another place where Marxism and Judeo-Christianity, they're not just different, they're opposite. It's not just variant 1 and variant 2. These are seriously different ideas. And so there's another reason you can't be a Marxist and Christian. And then there's the idea that, that Marx had, that religion was the opiate of the masses, which doesn't exactly sound like. I've always thought religion was the opiate of the masses, but communism, Marxism was the methamphetamine of the masses, let's say. Yeah, the meth of the masses. And then there's the idea that, that Marx had, that religion was the opiate of the masses, which doesn't exactly sound like. I've always thought religion was the opiate of the masses, but communism, Marxism was the methamphetamine of the masses, let's say. Yeah, the meth of the masses. The meth of the masses. Yeah, the meth of the masses. Let's say, the meth of the masses, the meth of the masses, the meth of the masses. We had no idea with regards to opium. So here's what Marx has to say about religion. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness, to call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. It's interesting to me because it's not like the Judeo-Christian story was really a happy one, as far as I can tell. You know, I mean, there was heaven, but chances you were going to get in, man, that was low. And mostly it was a fair bit of original sin, you know, and a fair bit of you wrestling with all of your inadequacies and your proclivity towards malevolence. To pick up your cross, to bear your suffering, to understand that there was a war in your soul between the forces of good and evil. It's like how that's an opiate is beyond me. I mean, if I was going to design an opiate that made people feel better, I'd certainly dispense with a fair bit of that. It's like, whatever you do is okay. We can start with that. There's certainly no hell. That's something we're going to get rid of right away. A little less guilt and shame would be. It could be like a hippie cult in the 1960s, you know, with a little more marijuana and some free sex, something like that. So I don't really understand the illusion idea. There is Marx's criticism, I suppose, of the belief of, you know, the great father in the sky who still doesn't seem to me to be that, like, he's sort of still kind of a nightmarish creature, all things considered, since at least in principle he's keeping track of everything you do, even more than you are, and that's not such a good thing. But whatever, it's a foolish criticism, as far as I can tell. It doesn't matter, he still criticized it. But it's a foolish criticism, as far as I can tell. It's a foolish criticism, as far as I can tell. You know, there was a war in your soul between the forces of good and evil. How that's an opiate is beyond me. How that's an opiate is beyond me. You know, there was a war in your soul between the forces of good and evil. It's like how that's an opiate is beyond me. How that's an opiate is beyond me. You know, there was a war in your soul between the forces of good and evil. How that's an opiate is beyond me. I mean, if I was going to design an opiate that made people feel better, I'd certainly dispense with a fair bit of that. It's like, whatever you do is okay. We can start with that. There's certainly no hell. So it's a foolish criticism, as far as I can tell. Foolish criticism, as far as I can tell. Doesn't matter, he still criticized it. The criticism of religion is therefore in embryo the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Criticism, meaning his, has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order that man shall continue to bear that chain without fantasy or consolation, but so that he shall throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. That's something that plenty of Marxists did, I can tell you. The criticism of religion disillusions man so that he will think, act, and fashion his reality like a man who has discarded his illusions and regained his senses, so that he will move around himself as his own true sun. S-U-N. Yeah, well, that's Marxism in a nutshell, all right. That's the fundamental definition of pathological narcissism. So that he will move around himself as his own true sun, right? Religion is only the illusory sun, which revolves around man as long as he does not revolve around himself. And you know, generally, don't we use that as an insult? He only revolves around himself? Isn't that an insult? And is there a reason for that? Don't we assume that there's something that you should be revolving around that isn't just yourself? You know, and it could be many things, you know. It could be, well, someone you love, that would be a start. It could be a child, could be your partner in life. It could be your family in extension. It could be your community. It could be some noble ideal that you're trying to serve. It should be something other than you as the primary center of the universe around which, well, you and presumably everything else revolves. So I don't really see that as a particularly wise, what would you call it, philosophy. And as it manifested itself in the world, I would say Stalin probably revolved around himself quite nicely, don't you think? I mean, if you had to pick someone who was revolving around himself, it would be a pretty decent competition between Mao and Stalin, and that didn't seem to be for the best. So that's something to consider as well. The Marxists believe that religion hindered human development, and the Soviets and the Maoists instituted state atheism, apart from the worship of their leaders, of course. This is a good one. I found this a while back. God, it's a rough poem. And you want to let your imagination sort of, I would say, let your imagination loose with this poem, which is what you should do with a poem. And imagine the sort of state of mind that you have to be in to write a poem like this. And then also imagine, as you should, that poetry, like dreams, it's the birthplace of thought. With my undergraduates often, especially ones that are really obsessed with ideas, they'll often put really bad poetry in their essays. And I'm not saying that in a cynical way, because bad poetry can have good ideas in it. It's hard to write good poetry, But the thing is, often an idea that's extraordinarily emotional in content will manifest itself as a poem before it is able to articulate itself out into a fully expressed philosophy. And so I see this with my undergraduates. They'll really be obsessed with something that's bothering them, then they'll write some poem, often about a personal experience, and then as I help them shape the essay, they kind of unfold the poem into an articulated statement about the structure of reality. And so you could say, well, we're all embedded in the dream. We know that. You go to sleep every night and you dream. You're embedded in your imagination. If you're forbidden to dream, if you're deprived of your dreams, you will lose your mind. That's been experimentally demonstrated quite nicely on animals, but also on human beings. You have to dream. You have to enter that realm of incoherent imagination and possibility in order to maintain your sanity, which is extraordinarily interesting and very strange. And I would say poetry exists on the border between the dream and fully articulate wakefulness. It's the place where the image of the dream meets the articulated speech of full consciousness. And so you can think about that with regards to this poem. God, it's a rough poem. I would say let your imagination loose with this poem, which is what you should do with a poem. Imagine the sort of state of mind that you have to be in to write a poem like this. God, it's a rough poem. Of one in despair. So, a God has snatched from me all, my all, in the curse and rack of destiny. All his worlds are gone beyond recall. Nothing but revenge is left to me. On myself, revenge I'll proudly wreak. on that being, that enthroned Lord. Make my strength a patchwork of what's weak. Leave my better self without reward. I shall build my throne high overhead. Cold, tremendous shall its summit be. For its bulwark, superstitious dread. For its marshal, blackest agony. Who looks upon it with a healthy eye shall turn back, struck deathly pale and dumb, clutched by blind and chill mortality. May his happiness prepare its tomb. And the Almighty's lightning shall rebound from that massive iron giant. If he brings my walls and towers down, eternity shall raise them up, defiant. Well, I would say that's the sort of poem that would be written by someone who revolved around himself as his own true son. And I would also say that given what we know about what happened as a consequence of the instantiation of Marxist doctrine, that this is a truly horrifying piece of literature to contemplate. Written, by the way, when Marx was rather young. This is a truly horrifying piece of literature to contemplate. Written, by the way, when Marx was rather young. For its bulwark, superstitious dread. For its marshal, blackest agony. Who looks upon it with a healthy eye shall turn back, struck deathly pale and dumb, clutched by blind and chill mortality. May his happiness prepare its tomb. Then the question came to me, do I believe in God? And I don't like that question. And people have complained at me a lot, and I'm sure they have their reasons, because they don't like my answers. You know, and I have two answers. They've kind of become stock, which is not a good thing. But they're the best approach. I can't figure out why I don't like the question exactly. I've got I had three sort of burgeoning hypotheses. One was, it's none of your damn business. That's the first one. So it's like a privacy issue. Like, it seemed to me to be a question that was too private to be answered properly. And so, you know, you could consider that a cop-out. Maybe it is. And then another one was, well, what do you mean by believe? Like, do you mean the words? Do you mean to say the words, I believe in God? Does that indicate that you believe in God? Like, I don't know what you mean by believe exactly. And that's got me in trouble too, because, you know, people think that attempting to clarify the meaning of words is an attempt to escape from the question, when it's actually an attempt to specify the question. I mean, is what you believe what you say, or what you act out? Now, you know, I would say to some degree it's both, but if push comes to shove, as far as I'm concerned, what you believe is what you act out, not what you say. And then, you know, and if you're an integrated person, then what you act out and what you say are the same thing. And then you're a person whose word can be trusted, right? Because what you say and what you do are isomorphic. They're the same thing. But belief is instantiated in action. So I have also suggested that I act as if I believe in God, or to the best of my ability. And people aren't very happy with that either. And then the third is that I'm afraid that he might exist, which I think is the most comical of the three answers, and perhaps the most accurate one. But then And I was thinking about what I might talk to you guys about. And I thought, well, let's go into this a little bit more. Let's say you do believe in God. Say, I believe in God. It's like, okay, well, that's hypothetically pretty impressive, I would say. It's like you believe that there's a divine power that oversees everything, that is fundamentally ethical, that's watching everything you do, and you believe that. And so what effect does that have on your behavior if you believe it? Does that mean that are you all in on your beliefs? Are you sacrificing everything to this transcendent entity that you proclaim belief in? Have you cleansed yourself of all your sin, let's say? Are you making all the sacrifices that you need to make? Like, have you taken the mote out of your eye? No. Or are you in the same situation, let's say, that the Catholic Church seems to be in right now? Just out of curiosity, it's a good time to bring that up, since the Pope seems to be concerned with what's been happening with the Catholic Church, given the endless pedophilic scandals, let's say, which seem rather serious in my estimation, and might have been something that was cleaned up perhaps 100 or 1,000 years ago, and it's being taken seriously perhaps now, and perhaps not, because it's not so easy to determine exactly what it would mean to take that seriously. And you might say, well, are all the people who are committing these heinous actions and then covering them up? If you ask them, well, do you believe in God? What are they going to say? You'd think the answer would be yes, given that they're like priests. And yet, what's the evidence? Well, the evidence isn't exactly so clear that the mere statement, let's say, or the mere acting out of the ritual, let's say, and I'm not trying to denigrate the statement or the ritual, but I'm pointing out that that's no indication of you're right to say that you believe. And I think this is why it bothered me to answer this question. It's like, what right do I have to say that, to make that claim? I believe in God. Well, what's the claim? Is that the claim that I'm a good person somehow? Because you'd think that if you believed in God, actually, like seriously, you'd be a good person, like right now, because, well, for obvious reasons, I would think. And so if that hasn't happened in some sort of miraculous sense, so that you're the best person you could possibly imagine being on an ongoing basis, and then terrified of deviating from that path in a serious manner, then I don't see why you have the right to say that you believe in God. The right to say that you believe in God? I don't see why you have the right to say that you believe in God. Said about Christianity. He was a great critic of Christianity, although also a great friend in a very peculiar way, in that sometimes your best friend is the one who points out your weakest properties, let's say. He said as far as he was concerned, there was only one Christian and he died on the cross. And that's a, perhaps an extreme statement, but one worth giving some consideration to. What are you called upon? Let's say if you're going to proclaim yourself as a believer, And I thought about this a lot as I've gone through the Old Testament. I did a bunch of lectures last year. So what are you called upon? Well, you're called upon initially to means to take the opportunities that are in front of you, the potential future, and to transform it into the present in the best possible way, using truth and courage and careful articulation as your guide. So that's the first thing you're called on to do. That's a major deal there. That's a tough one. And then the second is to make the proper sacrifices. That's the Cain and Abel story. It's like you want something, you genuinely want it, you want to set the world straight, then you let go of what's necessary and you pursue. You let go of what isn't necessary, no matter what it is. No matter what it is. And then you pursue what's necessary, and then maybe you sacrifice your children to God. That was the story. That's one of the next stories that comes up, of course, and you think, well, that's pretty damn barbaric, and the way the story's laid out, of course it is, but that isn't exactly what it means. It means that what you try to do when you raise children is that you try to do everything you can to impress upon them by imitation and by instruction and by love and by encouragement that they are crucial beings in the world whose ethical decisions play an important role in shaping the structure of reality itself, and that they have the moral responsibility to do that. And you get your ark in order. That's your family, let's say, so that when the storms come, you can stay above water for the 40 days of flooding, and you're capable of leading your people through the desert when the desert makes itself manifest, and you can escape from tyranny properly because you're wise enough to see it, and you take the full burden of being on yourself, all the suffering that's part and parcel of that. You accept that voluntarily, let's say, and you do everything you can to confront the malevolence that's part of you and that's part of the state and that's part of the world. And you make a garden around you. That's the paradise, a walled garden. It's a well-watered place, so the forces of nature and society exist together in harmony, and you place your family in that so that they can live properly. And you treat your enemy as if he's yourself, and the same with your brother. And, well, then you can say, maybe then you have the right to say that you believe in God. Otherwise, maybe you should think twice about it. You should think twice about it. You should think twice about it. Because, you know, there's a line in the New Testament that Christ himself says. Two of them, I should read them too, because they're very relevant to this. I guess I could paraphrase them. A rich man comes up to Christ and says, good leader, good Lord. And he asks him a question about how it is that he should be a good person. And Christ says, don't call me good. There's no one that's good but God. And, you know, that's worth thinking about. I mean, the one person that in principle, in in our ancient stories, had the right to make some direct connection between himself and the divine, was unwilling to do it when challenged. And so it might be reasonable to assume that each of us could be much more cautious about making that sort of statement bluntly when we're asked. And then the other line is, not all those who say, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Got that about right? Which means something approximating, just because you make a claim to moral virtue, let's say, your belief in God, which I can't see how you can make a higher claim to moral virtue than that. You know, I mean, agnostic, atheistic, I don't really care. The point is something like this. Imagine something of ultimate transcendent value. I don't care whether you believe in it or not, but imagine that something like that exists, and then you swear allegiance to it, which is to say, I believe in this. I mean, there's a heavy moral burden that comes along with that, just to allow yourself to utter the words without feeling that you should be immediately struck down appropriately by lightning. And so I think that's why that question makes me uncomfortable. It's that I don't think I have a right to make that proclamation. That I learned when I was going through these biblical lectures. It was a fascinating thing to do. It was the story of Jacob, who became Israel, and Jacob was a real trickster. You know, he was a morally ambiguous figure, to put it mildly. I mean, he tricked his older brother out of his birthright, and he was full of tricks, and he had a lot of tricks played on him too, and maybe learned something as a consequence. Anyways, after running away from his brother, who had murderous thoughts, and for good reasons, for like about 20 years. Maybe it was only 14. But doesn't matter, it was a long time. He decided that he would go back and try to make peace. And he came to this river. He sent his family across the river, along with his belongings, and partly as an offering to his brother, a peace offering. And he had a dream, visionary experience, hallucination, God, who knows what it was. And he dreamt that he wrestled with an angel all night, and that the angel was God. And he won, which is very strange because, well, first of all, he was a trickster figure, you know, like he wasn't your most upstanding moral creature. He wasn't Noah, for example. And second, well, it was God, you know? It's like, if you're gonna wrestle with someone and lose, there's an opponent that's likely to take you out. And he did damage his hip. So, which is not that impressive an accomplishment on God's part, in my estimation. And it's a very interesting story, because what it does indicate, what's so cool about it, you see, Jacob's name is changed at that point to Israel. And Israel means those who wrestle with God. And then that blew me away. That's one of the things I love about studying old stories, is now and then you come across a piece of one, and you see into it, you know, you see down into the depths that characterizes it. It's very difficult, but happens sometimes. And it just flattens you. You know, to think that if Israel is the chosen people of God, that's the hypothesis, and what Israel means is those who wrestle with God, then I think that seems to me to be such a hopeful idea, because, well, everyone does that to some degree. I mean, you do that in your life because, well, you don't know what's of fundamental transcendent worth, you know, because who the hell are you and what do you know? You know, you're struggling all the time with, well, I would say with good and evil. You're struggling with yourself, you're struggling with the world. To portray that as wrestling with God, that's perfectly reasonable from a metaphoric perspective. And the idea that that's what characterizes the true people of God is that willingness to wrestle. That's really something, because it kind of indicates that you're here as a contender, you know? You're not here to be happy, you're not here to be complacent, you're not here to be materially satisfied, not that that would be possible anyways, but that you're here to contend with the structure of reality, right? And that's what'll satisfy you, because there's something to you. You know, you're not weak and nothing. There's something to you. Something malevolent and terrible. I mean, you know that. You look at how people behave. You look at the blood and catastrophe of our history. You can certainly see the absolute hellish depths of the human soul, but there's something that takes root in that and grows up out of that that's absolutely magnificent beyond belief, and it's looking to contend. I've often thought that I've been fortunate in my marriage, because you think, well, you get married and you live happily ever after. It's like, that's not it. You don't want that even. You know what do you want? You want your partner to do just all she's going to do is sprinkle rose petals in front of you, right? And pat you on the back of the head and tell you how wonderful you are constantly, day after day. Man, you'd be so sick of that after maybe it'd take a month. But let's say 2 weeks, you'd be, because you know, she should be more on the side of who you could be than on the side of who you are. And if she's deluded enough or terrified enough to worship you in your current form, then, well, that doesn't say much for her. And it certainly isn't very helpful for you. You want someone that's gonna get in the way now and then, you know, and to contend with. And I've been fortunate in my marriage because I have someone to contend with. You know, we have our discussions, and they're not easy. Partly because we have hard problems to solve, because life is full of hard problems. I want someone who'll stand up, you know, and have her say, even if it's not what I would say. Partly because we have hard problems to solve, because life is full of hard problems. Maybe I'm even willing at times because she's quite intuitive and a good dreamer, and I'm more facile verbally, and so we have to be careful in our relationship, because if I'm in a particularly ornery mood and she has something to say, I can usually slice up her arguments verbally, you know, and that's fine as far as I'm concerned, because I get to win. But it's stupid. Well, it's stupid. It's, first of all, that doesn't mean I'm right. It just means I can formulate verbal arguments slightly faster than she can, but her intuitions and her dreams are often extraordinarily accurate. And so we've learned to some degree, to buttress each other's arguments just on the off chance that the person that you were foolish enough to marry might know something you don't now and then about something important, you know. And so what do you want? Well, you want someone to contend with. Then it's an adventure, you know, and then you have someone that you love, and that you respect. And that's not a bad combination for longevity of relationship. And then maybe if you have someone that you love and respect and that you can communicate with, then your children also love and respect her or him. And then that's pretty good for them because they've got some parents that they could love and respect. That's a good combination. You know, it solidifies their life. And so you want to contend with them. And I've been fortunate in my marriage because I have someone to contend with. You know, we have our discussions, and they're not easy, because we have hard problems to solve, because life is full of hard problems. I want someone who'll stand up, you know, someone to contend with. Job that's challenging, I would say, that pushes you beyond what you already are. And God only knows how hard you need to be pushed in order to go beyond where you are. But you know, to some degree, if you have a choice, you know, it's not that uncommon that what we'll do is choose to be pushed to the limit, especially when we're at our best. We think, wow, where's the limit? Here, maybe I can manage that. I'm going to push myself right to the damn limit. Then I'm going to push myself a little bit over just to see if it's possible. And if that happens, then, you know, you emerge with a sense of triumph. I'm now more than I was, right? And maybe that's what you're here to be, is to be more than you were, trying to push those limits. And to do that, you contend with the world. You wrestle with God. You don't casually say, I believe. Because who knows? No one knows, right? We're separated from the infinite by death and ignorance. We don't know. We contend. We wrestle. You know, and in that maybe we find our destiny. At least we find our purpose. Find something that justifies us to some degree. You know, if I'm awake at night wondering and I think, God, you know, like I pushed myself as far as I could in this effort, whatever the effort that I'm considering happens to be. I pushed myself. I don't have a weight on my conscience because I let something go or I fail to accomplish something. I mean, I do often have those sorts of weights. I'm talking about the rare times when I don't. It's like, well, there's something that's where there's some atonement and some peace, as far as I'm concerned, where that contending and that wrestling has been successful. And I would say that insofar as you're deeply involved in that, like completely involved in that, thoroughly involved in that, then you have the right to say that you believe in God. And since I'm not like that 100% of the time, or even approximating the percent of the time that I would like to be like that, you know, despite my best efforts, then when people ask me, I'm not going to say something virtuous, like I'm a believer, because there's plenty wrong with me that needs to be fixed before I would dare utter words like that. Thank you. So that's a better answer to that question. So thank you very much for walking through that with me, let's say. Now, many of you have asked some questions tonight, and so now what I'm going to do is looking through the questions that you asked and seeing if I have anything that isn't completely incomprehensible and embarrassing to say about them. So let's try that. Let's try that. Let's try that. Well, this is a strange one. I don't know about you people from Sydney. So, it's from Kathy Newman, which strikes me as somewhat unlikely. And it's got 164 upvotes, so which is quite a few upvotes. It hurt when you destroyed me on ABC. Now, I don't know if that's referring to last night or so many months ago, but I've enrolled in university to get my facts right. Yeah, well, that probably won't work. Thank you for enlightening my soul. The burns are still healing. Yeah, well, it's not exactly a question. It's 4 sentences that are quite the strange combination. I would say something about the burns are still healing. You know, I mean, said that you could tell much about a man's character by how much truth he could tolerate, which is very interesting. You know, there's an idea in the great Western tradition that the truth is the way and the path of life, and that no one comes to the Father except through the truth. I believe that to be the case. I don't think that you can manifest who you are without the truth. And so I think it's literally and metaphorically truth, that the pathway to who you could be if you were completely who you were is through the truth. And I would say, and so the truth does set you free, but the problem is that it destroys everything that isn't worthy in you as it sets you free, and that's a process of burning, and it's painful because you cling to what you shouldn't be, partly out of pride and partly out of ignorance and partly out of laziness, and so then you encounter something true, and you all know this perfectly well, because when was the last time that you learned something important that wasn't a blow of some sort, you know? And it's often you look back at your life and you think, oh God, I really learned something there. I wouldn't want to do that again, but it really changed my life. I mean, sometimes it can really destroy you, you know, an encounter with the truth, and you never really recover. But now and then something comes along and straightens you out, and a lot of you has to go. A lot of you has to burn away, you know, and I suppose in some sense the idea is that everything about you that isn't worthy is to be put into the flames. And that's another reason to be not so casual about claiming what you believe, because it isn't something that you undertake without due caution. That's another reason to be not so casual about claiming what you believe, because it isn't something that you undertake without due caution. Without due caution. Without due caution. Without due caution. kid, about 25 or so, a little older than a kid, that almost everything that I said was one form of lie or another. And I wasn't any worse, I would say, than the people that I was associating with, or any better. And the lies were manifold. You know, they were attempts to win arguments for the sake of winning the argument. That might be one. Attempts to indicate my intellectual prowess when there were competitions of that sort. Maybe just the sheer pleasure of engaging in an intellectual argument and winning. My inability to distinguish between ideas that I had read and incorporated because I had read, but hadn't realized that I hadn't yet earned the right to use. All of that. And, you know, I had this experience that lasted a long time. Well, I would say it's really never gone away. And I think this was the awakening of my conscience, essentially. And I didn't realize this until much later when I was reading Socrates' Apology. This voice, for lack of a better word, made itself manifest inside me, and it said every time I said something that wasn't true, and that's usually what it said. That's not true. You don't believe that. Or there was a sensation that was associated with it. I don't think this is that uncommon, you know. I asked my psychology classes for many years in a row if they had an experience, this experience, that they had a voice in their head, let's say, it's a metaphor, or a feeling that communicated to them when they were about to do something wrong. And it was universally the case that people agreed with one of those statements or another. And the other thing I would ask is, well, do you always listen to it? And of course the answer to that was definitely no. But that's also very interesting, you know, that you can have this faculty, this conscience. This seems to me to be very tightly associated with the idea of free will, is that you can have this internal voice, this daemon, the root word for democracy. Oh yes, I didn't finish that story. Yes, well, it's important. Well, so Socrates' daemon told him it was his moral guide. And democracy appears to be predicated on the idea that the polity will function if people attend to their consciences. That's the overlap of those conceptualizations. And well, first of all, I think that's the case, you know, and it makes a certain amount of logical sense. I mean, if we assume that the political state is something like the emergent consequence of the decisions of all its citizens, we would assume that the wiser the decisions of the citizens, the more upright and functional the state. I can't see how it could be any other way. And perhaps those who are the most upright, who listen to their consciences more carefully, even play a disproportionately powerful role. It's certainly possible. So, anyways, well, back to truth. You know, I learned that so much of what I was doing was false. And I think I learned this. There's a reason that this came to me so clearly. I was trying to understand why people did terrible things. And I was really concentrating on the terrible things that people do. And I was interested in Auschwitz, for example, and not as a political phenomenon, but as a psychological phenomenon. I was curious about how you could be an Auschwitz guard And I wasn't really curious about how you could be one because, well, you could be one now. Of course. I was more curious about how I could be one being such a good person, as I thought I was. But I also knew that many people did many terrible things during the 20th century, and the idea that I was somehow better than them, or that I should assume a priori that I was better than them and that I wouldn't have made the same choices or worse had I been in the same situation, was a very, very, very dangerous supposition. And in fact, a sufficiently dangerous supposition to bring about the very danger that I assumed was worth avoiding. I had this idea, that what had happened, especially in Nazi Germany, but also in the Soviet Union, shouldn't happen again. That what we needed to do, because of what happened in the 20th century, especially because we also managed to create hydrogen bombs, and that we had become so technologically powerful that there wasn't time for that anymore. The time for that was over, and that we really needed to understand why it happened, and that perhaps we could go deep enough in that understanding, which is, I think, what happens when you go deep in understanding, so that you could stop it. Because if you understand a problem, maybe you can solve it. And at least in part, I came to believe that the problem was, as Solzhenitsyn said, that the problem is that the line between good and evil runs down every human heart. And I was reading Jung at the same time, and he believed that the human soul was a tree whose roots grew all the way to hell, and believed also that in the full investigation of the shadow, which was the dark side of the human psyche, was that it was bottomless, essentially, that it was like an experience of hell. And that also struck me as true, and that the way to stop those sorts of things from happening was to stop yourself from being the sort of person who would do it, who would even start to do it. Because the other thing you learn when you learn about atrocities of that sort, you could read Ordinary Men, which is an unbelievably great study of exactly this sort of phenomenon. It's on my book list on my website. It's about a group of German policemen who were turned into brutal murderers over a period of months when they went into Poland after the Germans had marched through. And they were just ordinary middle-class men. And they weren't forced into this by their leadership, by the way, either, which is one of the things that makes the book so interesting. So, for me, it was a matter of understanding that if we want this sort of thing to not happen anymore, then we have to start to become the sort of people who wouldn't do it. It seems rather self-evident, all things considered, unless, you believe that we're the pawns of social forces, for example, like the Marxists do. And I don't believe that, because we're also the creator of social forces. And we're also capable of standing up to social forces, because I would say the individual is more powerful than the social force, all things considered, interestingly enough. That the way to stop such things from happening, the way to remember properly, is to understand that you could do it. That you could do those terrible things because the people who did them were like you. And that the way out of that is to stop being like that. And the way you stop being like that is, well, at least in part, by ceasing to tell yourself lies that you don't believe in, and that you shouldn't act out. Ceasing to tell yourself lies that you don't believe in, and that you shouldn't act out. you do and say is actually false. It's a lot of work to clean that up, a lot. But the consequences are, in principle, worthwhile. And so that was part of what drove me towards clinical psychology. Understanding that was part of what drove me towards clinical psychology, saying away from political science and law and from politics in general, because I started to believe that, and I think this is the great Western idea, which people were quite irritated about, by the way, on Q&A last night as well, that the proper route forward for the redemption of the individual and for mankind as a whole is as a consequence of the redemption of each individual. And I truly believe that. And I believe that that occurs as a consequence of adherence to the truth and courage in the face of being. That's rule one, right? To stand up straight with your shoulders back, is to take on the onslaught and to enter the contentious ring, and to do more than your best. Because your best isn't enough. Because your best isn't as good as you could be. You have to push yourself past that. And that's, as far as I can tell, where you find what you need in life. You find the meaning that sustains you in life, and you find the patterns of action that redeem the world, both at the same time. I mean, life is a very difficult business. You know, it's fatal. And it's full of suffering. And it's full of betrayal and malevolence. There's nothing about it that's trivial. It's all profound. And in order to find your way through all of that capacity for hellish experience, let's say, you need to develop a relationship with something that's profound. And you can have that capacity. And what could be more profound than the truth? And what would you rather have on your side? And you might say, well, that's obvious, and of course everyone should do that, and then you need to know why you don't. And the answer is, well, sort of encapsulated in this first amusing question. Thank you for enlightening my soul. The burns are still healing. It's like, well, you know, there's no shortage of deadwood to burn off. And there's no shortage of pain when the deadwood burns off. And that's what makes people afraid of the truth. You know, maybe that's why Moses encountered God in a burning bush. Who the hell knows? But there's something about that idea that seems to me to be the case. And so, what's the decision that you make? You know, you decide to believe. You know, it's a risk, an existential risk. It's an act of faith. You believe that the truth can set you free. You believe that people have an intrinsic divinity about their soul. You decide that you're going to live in that manner and that you're going to let everything about yourself that isn't worthy of that goal die. And that might be almost everything that you are. And that's a terrible thing to contemplate. The only thing that's worse, I would say, is the alternative. Because the alternative is the sorts of hells that we manage to produce around us and that we produce with particular expertise. During the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century.
I pray to God this time I learned my lesson. I'm on my knees and hope you can forgive me. You lay to rest my sin and my self-pity. The doors are shut, no letting in the vultures. The mask is cracked, part of a sinful culture. Whatever weakness now I might display, let it glorify you till the endless day. Been lost so often I could never count. You left your sheep and looked till I was found. Never thought someone could love me that much. And willingness to pick up where we left off. In the end I'm always calling back to you. Ashamed of who I am, ashamed before I do.